Plus 20 and all the activities that led up to that event probably left a lot of people disappointed. And if one was to draw a contrast between 1992, the Rio Summit, the UN Conference on Environment and Development, then clearly that particular event was much more purposeful and much more conclusive event than we found this time in 2012. And let's remember that on that occasion, 3 global agreements were given birth at the 1992 Rio Summit. Now this time there were really no agreements that were arrived at, but to some extent may I say that it was an achievement of sorts that we got a 50+ page document which represents the future we want. And this is a very comprehensive document. So while it didn't require the global community to take specific actions, it does provide a framework within which action can be taken in a number of fields. And this is where may I submit that an institution like this has a very important role to play, because we can highlight some of the elements that came out of Rio Plus 20 in the form of that document called The Future We Want, and try to help society and all the stakeholders in society to start taking action. And this would certainly require our being able to, an institution like this, being able to talk to government, talk to business and industry, and of course to civil society. Now, the good news is that in Rio Plus 20, there was a very large participation on the part of business, and not just at the junior level, not purely at a symbolic level, but at very senior levels. There were a large number of CEOs that participated in Rio Plus 20, and that I think is a very good indicator. It shows that business is now getting interested in some of the actions that were discussed in Rio Plus 20. And they would be there only if they saw an opportunity arising out of it. I'm sorry. And that opportunity clearly will take several forms, because and I think this is something that we can build on, because business and industry, which has been largely guilty of taking a very short-term view, is now looking at longer-term possibilities. And while most people say that the current economic downturn is a damper on protecting the environment, pursuing sustainable development, it also is an opportunity whereby business is now looking at longer-term possibilities, because they realize that only doing things for the next quarter and focusing only on the bottom line for the next year is probably not going to be enough. And they are looking for competitive opportunities which look much longer into the future. So against this background, let me present to you some issues related particularly to climate change. Now, it's interesting that climate change was not on the agenda of Rio Plus 20, and it's been discussed in 3 paragraphs in the final document, in the future we want. But it does not require any actions that were spelled out on the occasion. However, as they say, climate change was the big gorilla in the room, because in all the discussions that took place, and particularly in the side events that took place over there, climate change couldn't be wished away. Climate change was very much a part of the actions that were discussed. Now, I'm afraid there were political reasons for not including climate change in the agenda of Rio Plus 20. These were largely because some countries felt that there is a parallel process under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where climate change is going to be discussed and acted on, and therefore there was no need to build it into the Rio Plus 20 agenda. And there were also some countries that felt that if climate change was discussed, and perhaps there would be some language in the document that would require some action, they would find it difficult to sell it to their own constituencies. And I hope there's no media here. No. Okay. Particularly in the US, given the fact that even President Obama has been very quiet on climate change, the feeling was that if anything was included in the document coming out of Rio Plus 20 that deals with climate change, it could be used by the other side in the campaign for the presidency. And therefore, I think there were political reasons why climate change was not included in the agenda. Okay. Now, why should we worry about climate change? Well, firstly, if you look at observations during the last century, and in fact since the beginning of industrialization, this is the way the average surface temperature has changed. And you can see while there are fluctuations which are the result of both human as well as natural changes that take place in the climate, what is significant is that in the last 50 or 60 years, the trend has been upward. And we have said very clearly in the IPCC 4th Assessment Report that most of the warming that has taken place since the middle of the last century is very likely the result of increase in anthropogenic concentration of greenhouse gases. And when we use the term very lightly, we are assigning a probability of more than 90%. And you can see it over here, that human actions have now really started affecting the climate of this planet. Now, as a result of melting of the various bodies of ice, as well as thermal expansion of the ocean, we've had sea level rise of 17 centimeters during the last century. And incidentally, the temperature increase during the last 100 years has been about 0.74 degrees Celsius. The third picture over here is about reduction in snow cover. Now, if you look at surface temperature changes, we have projected that by the end of this century we could get further warming of 1.1 degrees Celsius to 6.4 degrees Celsius. Now 6.4 degrees Celsius, or anywhere close to that, would really be disastrous for all forms of life. And of course, warming is not uniform. For instance, the Arctic region is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the planet. We have really done very little about dealing with this problem, because if you see, between 1970 and 2004, greenhouse gas emissions increased by 70%, even though the Framework Convention on Climate Change came into existence in 1992. So this is a convention which has not really been implemented as intended. We had the Kyoto Protocol, which was the means by which the convention was to be implemented. But as you know, the first commitment period is running out this year, and beyond that we don't have anything in place. Commercial, and what are the projected impacts? Commercial forestry productivity rises modestly with climate change. Smallholder and subsistence farmers pastoralists and artisanal fisher folk will suffer complex, localized impacts. So it's really the small farmers, the small pastoralists, the small fishermen who are really going to be impacted by this. And there would be consequently implications for food insecurity as a result of climate change. And we also know that many millions of people are projected to be flooded every year due to sea level rise by the 2080s. The numbers will be largest in the mega deltas of Asia and Africa, while small island states are especially vulnerable. I mentioned to you that in the last century, sea level rise was an average of 17 centimeters. Now, for an island like Tuvalu or the Maldives Islands, that is a very serious threat because the land in these particular nations is barely a meter above sea level. So if 17 centimeters is the increase, then every time there's coastal flooding, then it has major implications on threat to life and property. Also, let us accept the fact that there are some industries that are going to be affected. And I'm mentioning this only because business and industry has to understand the reality that they are very much part of this planet, and if there are going to be impacts on their operations because of climate change, then they have to be part of the solution. Tourism, for instance, is very sensitive to temperature changes, hours of sunshine, precipitation, humidity, storm intensity and frequency. For instance, if, let us say, snowfall is going to change in some of the ski areas of Europe, then clearly that's going to have a major implication on tourism in that area. So the reality is that we're all stakeholders in climate change and its impacts. We cannot shut our eyes to it. I also want to mention that these are some of the references in the Future We Want document where we have talked about, the document talks about the importance of the Après Rio Convention to advancing sustainable development, and in this regard we urge all parties to fully implement their commitments under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It also talks about the scale and gravity of the negative impacts of climate change affecting all countries, and we reaffirm that climate change is one of the challenges of our time. So, there were 3 paragraphs where climate change has been included in the final document. Now, the heart of this particular convention is what is known as Article 2 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this is really the core of the convention. The intention of the convention is to see that we bring about stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient for ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change and to ensure that food security is not threatened and to enable economic development to take place in a sustainable manner. Now, this is an extremely important part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we in the IPCC have a major challenge to come up with enough scientific detail by which the negotiating community can decide and define what would be the right level of climate change to prevent some of the disastrous interference with the climate system. Now, without proper measures, climate change will likely exacerbate poverty and slow down economic growth in developing countries, because the worst affected are going to be the poorest countries in the world. It will act as a threat multiplier, especially in developing countries. It's very clear that climate change will exacerbate, that means multiply, existing stresses, which could be the result of water scarcity, which could be the result of malnutrition and hunger, and therefore with climate change some of these problems are going to become far more serious over time. We also know that between 1970 and 2008, over 95% of the natural disaster-related deaths occurred in the developing countries. And this is because you just don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the protective mechanisms by which in the developing countries people can deal with some of these impacts. And as it happens, these impacts occur much more in the developing countries than in the developed countries. Now, in this, the future we want, it says we stress the importance of stronger interlinkages among disaster risk reduction, recovery and long-term development. Because I think the world realizes that there are going to be many more risks associated with disasters than we have seen in the past. Now, the IPCC has brought out a special report on extreme events and disasters, and we found that the limits to resilience are faced when tipping points associated with social and/or natural systems are exceeded, posing severe challenges to adaptation. So, we have to adapt to the impacts of climate change, but you could reach certain thresholds where it becomes impossible and very, very challenging to be able to deal with some of the impacts. And therefore, it would be wrong to believe that whatever impacts take place in the future, we would be able to deal with them through adaptation. There is no getting away from the fact that we would also have to mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases. There are strategies that can help manage disaster risk now and also help improve people's livelihoods and well-being. The most effective strategies offer development benefits in the relatively near term and reduce vulnerability over the long term. If you can create conditions by which the threats from extreme events and disasters can be contained, then that would also help create the conditions for development. So I think there is a win-win opportunity over here, and therefore it is important for us to see that we put in place adaptation measures that would also promote development on a sustainable basis. And there are several strategies that can help manage disasters now, so that this can also help improve people's livelihoods and well-being. And there are effective strategies that offer development benefits in the relatively near term and reduce vulnerability over the longer term. Just to give you an example, when the Asian tsunami took place in 2004, there were really no early warning systems that were in place. Local communities were not organized to deal with something like the tsunami because nobody expected this. But now those measures have been put in place, and therefore I think it would be possible for people to save lives. In this very country, as you know, there was this heat wave in 2003 which caused massive death. Then there was another one in 2006 which was more or less the same intensity, but there were very few deaths in the second case because I think local communities and society at large were much better prepared to handle these disasters. Sustainability, of course, is not primarily an environmental issue. It involves a whole lot of other actions that are required. Education is certainly one of them. Improving disaster preparedness is important. Early warning systems are important. Promoting good governance, that's one of the focus issues of this particular series. increasing access to renewable energy is also important. And may I say that as far as governance is concerned, we have to focus on local initiatives, because the time has come. We cannot wait for global agreements to drive action. It is in the interests of society at the local level to be able to take initiatives by which we are able to protect life and property. And societies, of course, have a long record of adapting to the impacts of weather and climate. Adaptation is necessary, but adaptation to the impacts of climate change and promotion of sustainable development share common goals. And we have said very clearly that neither adaptation nor mitigation alone can avoid all climate change impacts. However, they will complement each other, and together they can significantly reduce the risks of climate change. Well, these are some of the words that have come out of Rio. We note with great concern the significant gap between aggregate mitigation pledges in terms of having a likely chance of holding the global average temperature between below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And it also said that we need cooperation by all countries. We need to find means by which we mobilize funding, because some of these measures will require funding, and in the developing countries that could be a serious constraint. So the global community has to find means by which we can minimize this particular constraint that exists. Now, just to mention one fact, in the IPCC 4th assessment report, we had estimated what would be required on a least cost pathway to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees to 2.4 degrees Celsius. And we found that CO2 emissions will have to peak no later than 2015. Now, if that was the case, then we really have 3 years in which we can take action. And the cost of mitigation is not going to be very high, because as you can see, if we had no mitigation, then you would get, let's say, a red line that's shown over here. If we had mitigation, then let's say the cost of taking action and therefore a slight reduction in GDP will give you the blue line over here. And we have found that by 2030, the total cost for mitigation would be no more than 3% of the global GDP. Now that means that the level of prosperity that the world would reach in 2030 would at best be postponed by a few months or a year, and that's really not a very high price to pay for avoiding some of the worst impacts of climate change. And there are huge co-benefits in taking these actions, because you will generate more employment, you have higher energy security, you have lower levels of air pollution at the local level, and therefore health benefits from that. And therefore what we really need to do is to link policies to provide the opportunity for no regrets measures that would reduce greenhouse gas mitigation costs. Article 3 of the Framework Convention talks about developed countries taking the lead first, and eventually perhaps we will all move towards a band of equal per capita emissions as an equitable solution. The future we want says that we recognize that improving energy efficiency, increasing the share of renewable energy, cleaner and energy efficient technology are important for sustainable development, including in addressing climate change. And we brought out a special report on renewable energy and climate change mitigation, where we have found that renewable energy can also make it possible for the 1.4 billion people without access to electricity being able to get electricity through decentralized and renewable means. And as it happens, the cost of renewable energy in several applications is already competitive with conventional forms of energy supply. So we really need to find those niche areas which are now expanding very rapidly and to implement renewable energy solutions in those cases. And we have found that 164 scenarios that have been assessed in that particular report show that a transition to higher shares of renewable energy would imply increasing investments in technologies and infrastructure. Policies, of course, plays a crucial role. Now, of these 164 scenarios, we found that the minimum would be 11% of total energy supply in 2050 globally, and the highest would be 77%. Now, all of that would be dependent on the right kinds of policies being put in place today. And what we really need is a completely new way of thinking, which is based on sustainable development. And excuse me. And as I said yesterday, Mahatma Gandhi was totally right when he said that speed is irrelevant if you are going in the wrong direction. If we are going to measure economic progress, excuse me, on the basis of GDP and the growth in GDP, we might be missing out on some of the negative implications of a complete orientation on GDP growth. And therefore, we also need to come up with new metrics by which we measure human welfare in the future. And that really would be the crux of sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, too. Well, we have room for a long debate. It's 9:30, so maybe we can have a debate now, except if you don't feel very well and you prefer it. It's okay. So just to begin with it, something was interesting here. I was listening to you about the idea of, imported sustainability can create an illusion. I mean that we can say, well, okay, we're sustainable here, for example, in North Country. And why? Because, well, we're just pouring somewhere else what we don't want. Or we create the conditions of our sustainability here at the cost of somewhere else. It's like, I don't know, filling an empty room with garbage, accepting that this room is not empty, there are people in it. So I think that's a part of the problem that make that a lot of people are not really interested in moving things. Well, that's so well, thank you. And there was this, what you told about natural disaster, and I was thinking about holistic recovery, and Boulder University, they speak a lot about that, but if you don't consider sustainability in areas large enough to integrate this part of imported sustainability, then it can't work, because you have antagonistic interests. So that was just an idea, I don't know, but just to start the discussion.
Well, it's interesting, an economist who I respected greatly and had the privilege of knowing was a person called Nicholas Rogan, who, in my view, should have got the Nobel Prize in economics, but he was too unconventional to be supported in his efforts. But he talked about entropy as being part of the economic process. Now, entropy is a physical concept and physical measure. But basically what he said is that if you produce and consume more and more, then you're also creating an entropy in the system. And therefore, I think we have to keep that in mind. Unfortunately, the economic profession has not taken that concept into account. So what you talked about, filling up this room, and we are just dumping externalities on all the global commons. And it's high time we realize that there's a huge cost associated with that, which will come back to us at some point of time. Even if you can't measure it, you refuse to measure it directly. The fact is, it is a very serious cost, and it's going to affect us, it will affect our children and grandchildren, and we have to take that into account.
Thank you. And we won't take any more, maybe there is some questions, 2 questions. And maybe I will begin with the first one from Unitar.
I can give you the microphone.
Thank you.
Good morning. Quite an honor to listen to your lecture. I just wanted to kindly ask you to expand a little if possible on this vision that you shared about local communities, local governments, taking over, if I may use this phrase, to actually become decision makers and proactive components of the solution, because we all know that local governance face the challenge of trying to make national governments understand that they are also part of the problem and the solution. How do you see this dynamic between national governments decreasing their role and selling and giving away some of the power and authority to local communities in order to tackle climate change?
I think that's a very good question. I think the answer lies in knowledge, in being able to show that you really can't get some of the solutions that you're looking for unless they are rooted in local reality. And I'm afraid we've been so used to waiting for our capitals and countries that we live in to give us all the directions. But now that we are living in an age when, really speaking, a lot of the solutions we know will have to be locally driven. Yes, of course, you need a policy framework which has to come at the national and sometimes even the international level. The initiatives really will have to be rooted at the local level. And this is where, if I may say, it is institutions like this which can make a difference. I think if you empower local communities with knowledge, then they would be much better equipped to demand what is expected of them. They would be much better equipped to implement solutions by which the world would get convinced that ultimately it is at the local level that you have to take action.
Hi, my name is John Church. I'm assistant professor here at the University of Mass. I'm assistant for the United Nations Commission for Europe. I have 3 questions for you. Very brief. The first one is, what do you think is going to be the impact of the current crisis? Because we're speaking in terms of 1 year of GDP in the future to address mitigation. We already see how tough it is to deal with the current crisis right now. How do you think it is possible to do this in the future? The second question is about what you think is the place of climate change and climate action in the Sustainable Development Goals that would be that are being developed for 2015. And the third question regards, I know you can speak about the details of assessment plan for 2025, but if you could comment a little bit on the challenges about downscaling global models of the region.
Okay, well, let me start with the last question that you asked. I think you really have a major challenge on your hands in being able to downscale global models and arriving at impacts at the local level. But I must say now there's so much of expertise and capacity which is being developed as a result of which we are much better equipped with the information and knowledge on the basis of models that are being run. That hopefully all of this will show up in the 5th assessment report. And in fact, in the 5th assessment report, we are much greater regional detail than we have had in the past. As a matter of fact, on the Working Group 2 report, we are going to have 2 volumes. One is going to look at sort of global impact, and the other will look at disaggregated regional impacts. So I expect much of the literature that has come out recently will be captured in that assessment. So I hope we'll have much more information in that regard, using large-scale modeling. So I'm pretty optimistic about that. On the congruence between climate change action and sustainable development, well, as it happens, there is so much of commonality in the actions that are required to deal with climate change and those actions which define sustainable development that I think the core benefits from taking action on climate change are huge in terms of benefits for sustainable development. So I expect this is something that will become much more apparent, and it would get apparent if the scientific community, the academic community is able to bring out some of the overlaps between climate change action and sustainability initiatives. I must say, by and large, the scientific community has failed in not getting the message out to the public. And I think the opportunity is there now. And we must most definitely deal with this particular challenge. Sorry, I forgot your first question.
The impact of the crisis on the
Oh, yeah,
financial
right.
crisis.
Yeah, well, you know, I think there's a churning which is taking place. You have countries like Germany, the Republic of Korea, which have clearly adopted a green path of development. And you'd be surprised, even a country like the People's Republic of China is now focusing on low carbon development. And I expect in the years ahead you will see a major action on their part. So it seems to me that the world will realize that there are much bigger benefits from changing direction towards a more green economic development than continuing with business as usual. It's not going to be easy, but I think a few beacon lights can really make a difference. I mean, if you look at Germany, excuse me, if you look at Germany, then clearly they've done very well despite the economic crisis. And that's largely because they have pursued a path of green development which has served them quite well. The same is true of the Republic of Korea. In the case of China, I mean, they've made major investments in renewable energy, so much so that they have wiped out a large part of the solar industry in America because they are selling equipment much cheaper than you can produce in the US. So I think people will see the strategic benefits and the sort of market opportunities inherent in going in the direction of a green pattern of development. And I expect in the next few years this will become the order of the day.
Okay, John, you can keep the microphone and if there's some other questions, just.
Somebody else.
Pierre Consal, I'm an economics researcher at this University of London Law. So those are the two fields give the instruments to get some policy implications. You have a very positive attitude in all this, and that's very good. Even your last answer. But could you say a little bit more about the biggest problems in this field? Now, you know, if you say minus 3% GDP in European terms, that is absolutely enormous. Other thing, you did mention China, but very often, even in India, people, well, sometimes they say, look, the people who are going to pay are the rich countries, not us. Another point, are people really aware of all the implications? Now, you didn't mention at all, maybe something that's more in America, but maybe elsewhere in the world as well, that your title is scientific assessment, and many people, a lot of people say, well, you know, there are many other indications that is against that you really have a climate change. So, my basic question is, did you take into account the real criticisms and problems in this whole thing?
Well, I think that's a very good set of questions. And if I was to identify the major problems, in very simple terms, the big impediment is vested interests. And you know, if you go back in time, whenever there has been new scientific or knowledge-based discovery, there has always been a group of people who would fight it tooth and nail. You take the case of tobacco and its link with lung cancer. I mean, for several years, for decades, in fact, the tobacco companies fought this tooth and nail. Mrs. Brundtland, when she was head of WHO, told me that they actually literally destroyed the careers of 3 or 4 scientists. And they will use every method, including attacking their personal lives, attacking everything that they stand for. So I think I'm not wishing away some of these real problems. Since there's no media, I can mention that you have the so-called Koch brothers in the US who are spending $100 million for 2 reasons. One is to see that there's no action on climate change, and the second is to see that Obama is defeated. So, you know, I think there's big money, there's big power behind it, and you can't wish that away. But I would say that it's a matter of time. Of course, time is crucial at this point of development. But I think in the end, knowledge will triumph, the truth will stand. And you said that I have a very positive outlook. I have that outlook for 2 reasons, because that's the only way I can survive. And secondly, I believe that truth will certainly prevail. I must tell you, Senator John Kerry, who's a good friend, saw me when I was going through all the troubles of attacks from everywhere. He came to New Delhi and he sent me a message that he'd like to meet me for a drink. So the moment he landed, he came to see me. He said, look, I made a mistake. I thought the truth would prevail. And therefore, when these guys mounted all those false accusations against me on that incident with the boat when he was in the war, he said, I thought that the truth will prevail, but I made a mistake. The truth doesn't prevail, and they damaged my run for the presidency. So I think you're absolutely right. There are very powerful interests, and we have to be aware of that. Now, you mentioned that 3% of the GDP in 2030 would be a lot in Europe. Well, the fact is, if you look at the impacts of climate change and you balance that expenditure versus the kind of savings that you would have in terms of the impacts of climate change on agriculture, on health, the impacts of sea level rise, the extreme events and disasters that affect life and property, then really speaking, the 3%, which is the upper limit, actually it will be much less. One of the things that we have found in the fourth assessment report is that in 2030, there will be net negative cost opportunities for mitigation of 6 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. And this is true in so many sectors of the economy. So I think we would be able to manage this with much less, not 3% of the GDP, but the benefits in terms of avoided costs of impacts would be huge. In the case of China and India, well, I'm reminded of what Mahatma Gandhi said, and I always use this example. He was asked, Mr. Gandhi, would you not want India to become as prosperous as Britain? And he said it took Britain to use half the resources of this planet to reach its level of prosperity. How many planets will India require? So, I think India is a country of 1.2 billion people, China is 1.3 billion people. If we aspire to the same standards of living, we would be like locusts, damaging everything that exists. We have to find a much more sustainable, a much more resource-efficient pattern of development. Otherwise, we're going to cause very serious problems, not just globally, but locally. So I hope that this wisdom, this sense will start dawning on people in the developing countries as well.
Thank you. Now it's 10 to 10, or 5 to 10. So if you have a last question, but a very short one, and then Professor Rajendra Bhattacharya will have to leave. Ladista, maybe the microphone. Okay.
Bhattacharya, I just wanted to comment. We have this huge opportunity of worldwide connectivity, access to information, the broadband system. Knowledge has become a moving immaterial system worldwide. Particularly in Brazil, we've had lots of problems with this. We have actually 2 or 3 corporations that are withholding this access to knowledge. But we still think and work on this knowledge access opportunity. And that this is opening for this issue. We have to comment on this.
Well, I think you need a very effective regulation to make sure that there is a fairness, there is an equitable access issue, which has to be built into the regulatory system and regulatory institutions. And I must say, developing countries have not done very well in that regard. We are learning, but I think the sooner we learn, the better it would be. This is certainly happening in the case of electricity and other services, but certainly the rate at which access to the new information age is increasing. It's very important that we put in place effective regulatory institutions over there.